Every flood map ever drawn for Houston is already obsolete, not because the maps were made carelessly, because the city beneath them has been moving downward for over 100 years. And the problem isn't just that Houston floods, it's what is sitting in the ground below it when it does. There's something I want you to hold on to before we get into the numbers. A team of researchers from Rice University, NYU, and Brown identified nearly 2,000 industrial sites in Harris County, sites that processed, dumped, or stored toxic chemicals that do not appear on any current federal cleanup registry. Not one. 2,000 sites buried under neighborhoods, under streets, under the yards of homes where families live right now. I'm going to come back to that, because by the time I do, you're going to understand exactly why it matters in a way that a number alone cannot tell you. Now, let's get into it. Number 1. The ground beneath Houston has already moved farther than most people would believe. Here is something the flood preparedness guides for Harris County do not lead with. The land in and around Houston has been sinking for more than a century, not slowly and imperceptibly, in some areas, dramatically. According to USGS geological records covering the Houston-Galveston region from 1906 through 1980, the Pasadena area, which sits along the Houston Ship Channel, one of the most industrialized corridors in the Western Hemisphere, sank more than 9 feet over that period. More than 9 feet of vertical drop, not from an earthquake, not from a sinkhole, from the quiet, relentless withdrawal of groundwater from the aquifers beneath the city's foundations. The mechanism is straightforward and unforgiving. Pull water out of the ground at the scale an industrial city requires, and the clay layers beneath begin to compact. The city does not fall, it settles. Year after year, inch by inch, sometimes faster during drought years when extraction intensifies, sometimes slower when regulators intervene, but the direction is always the same: down. A peer-reviewed study published in the journal Nature in March of 2024, authored by geophysicist Leonard Ohenhen and his colleagues from Virginia Tech, Brown University, and institutions across Canada, England, and India, examined 32 major U.S. coastal cities using high-resolution satellite radar measurements. It found that communities along the Gulf Coast, including Galveston, Freeport, Port Arthur, and Texas City, were experiencing annual subsidence rates of at least 5 millimeters per year. The study concluded that subsidence along the Gulf Coast accounts for somewhere between 23 and 35% of the total projected inundation exposure by 2050. That means more than a third of the flooding Houston and its surrounding communities will experience in the next 25 years is not caused by the ocean rising. It is caused by the city sinking to meet it. A follow-up study published in Nature Cities in May of 2025, covering all 28 of the most populous American cities, found that more than 42% of Houston's land area is sinking at faster than 5 millimeters per year, and 12% of the city is descending at more than 10 millimeters per year. Geophysicist Leonard Ohenhen describes subsidence as a pernicious, highly localized, and often overlooked problem. That phrasing matters. Overlooked. Because if you are looking only at sea level projections to understand Houston's flood risk, you are looking at half the equation. The city is not just being approached by rising water, it is dropping toward it. Number 2, Hurricane Harvey proved that what floods in Houston is not just streets and homes. In August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey made landfall and stalled over southeast Texas for 4 days, dropping more than 60 inches of rain in some locations, the highest rainfall total ever recorded from a tropical cyclone in the continental United States. Harris County experienced flooding of a scale the National Weather Service struggled to classify. More than 135,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. Around 30,000 people were displaced. But the Associated Press sent reporters into that disaster zone carrying a different question. Not how many homes had flooded, how many toxic sites had flooded with them. They surveyed 7 Superfund sites in and around Houston during the flooding. All 7 had been inundated with water, in some cases, many feet deep. If you live in the Houston area or anywhere nearby, drop a comment below. Tell me what you experienced during Harvey, what you saw in the water, what the neighborhood looked like afterward. This community pays close attention to local testimony, because what official reports describe in data, residents often saw with their own eyes. On the same day the AP published its first report, the Environmental Protection Agency reviewed aerial imagery and confirmed that 13 of the 41 Superfund sites in Texas had been flooded by Harvey and were, in the agency's own language, experiencing possible damage. The agency then added something that deserves to be stated plainly. The Houston area sites had, as EPA stated, not been accessible by response personnel. For more than 3 days after the most significant chemical disaster risk event in the city's recent history, federal responders could not physically reach the contaminated sites to assess what was happening inside them. No measurements, no sampling, no answers. The floodwaters that poured through Houston neighborhoods during Harvey were not just rainwater. They were rainwater plus whatever was in the ground. That distinction is not a minor technical point. It is the defining public health question of the next major storm. Number 3. The San Jacinto River waste pits. What 14 feet of floodwater does to a site holding one of the world's most toxic substances. In the 1960s, a pulp and paper mill operating along the San Jacinto River disposed of its waste in 2 impoundment areas built within the river's floodplain. The waste contained dioxins and furans, compounds that have been linked to cancer, birth defects, and immune system damage, and that do not dissolve easily in water. They bind to sediment and travel with it. The site was added to the EPA's National Priorities List, the Superfund designation reserved for the most seriously contaminated locations in the country, nearly a decade before Harvey. By 2011, regulators had installed a temporary cap, an armored layer of fabric and rock designed to hold the waste in place while a permanent cleanup plan was developed. That cap required extensive repairs on at least 6 separate occasions in the years before Harvey, with sections becoming displaced or going missing. When Harvey hit, the San Jacinto River waste pits were covered by approximately 14 feet of floodwater. The cap was breached. An unknown volume of dioxin-contaminated sediment was released into the river and potentially downstream into Galveston Bay. Post-flood sampling by the EPA found dioxins at 70,000 nanograms per kilogram at the site. The agency's own threshold for triggering cleanup action is 30 nanograms per kilogram. The number detected after Harvey was more than 2,300 times that threshold. In October 2017, the EPA approved a cleanup plan that called for excavating approximately 212,000 cubic yards of contaminated material. The estimated cost? $115 million. The responsible parties, International Paper and a subsidiary of Waste Management, had agreed to fund the engineering design phase. The full cleanup cost remained in dispute for years. Construction on the southern impoundment finally began in November of 2022, 5 years after the storm that demonstrated the site's vulnerability. That is not the number that should stop you. The number that should stop you is this. The San Jacinto River waste pits is one site. One in a county that, as the EPA confirmed in its own post-Harvey review, had more than a dozen Superfund locations, most of them in or adjacent to floodplains. Whole subdivisions in the Baytown, Pasadena area had to be abandoned in previous decades after sinking below sea level. The people who lived there left. The industrial legacy of what was processed in the earth beneath their homes did not leave with them. Make sure to hit like and subscribe to Project Nightwatch so you do not miss a single update on stories like this one. This channel follows what happens when scientific data, government records, and local reporting point in the same direction. And that direction is somewhere the evening news is not looking. Number 4. The 2,000 sites that no flood map has ever shown you. There is something I set aside before we got into the data. I want to come back to it now because everything you just heard was the frame for what I'm about to tell you. Research conducted by Jim Elliott, a sociologist at Rice University, working alongside colleagues at NYU and Brown, went back through historical records, property rolls, industrial permits, insurance documents, newspaper archives, and identified nearly 2,000 former industrial sites in Harris County that processed or stored hazardous materials and that no longer appear on any active federal registry. Not the EPA's Superfund list, not the toxic release inventory, not the RCRA hazardous waste database. 2,000 sites that, from a regulatory standpoint, do not exist. They existed. The chemicals that soaked into the ground when they operated may still be there. A 2024 analysis by Rice University's Center for Coastal Future and Adaptive Resilience found that Harris County has the highest concentration of flood-prone industrial facilities of any county in the United States, with more than 70% of its active industrial facilities already at elevated risk of flooding during heavy rain events. That figure covers only the facilities that are currently registered and monitored. It does not include the 2,000 sites that no one is monitoring because, officially, no one knows they need to be. We have probably the densest petrochemical corridor in the Western Hemisphere, said Dominic Boyer, co-director of Rice's Coastal Future Center, just some 10 miles from the fourth largest city in the country. When researchers at Rice mapped toxic releases not by property borders, because, as they noted, toxicity knows no borders, but by waterway, they found that Harris County's streams and bayous had received cumulative chemical inputs from industrial sites across the entire watershed. The water carries what the land holds. Here is what the compound threat actually looks like when you put the pieces together. A city that has sunk, in its most affected areas, more than 9 feet over the course of a century. A petrochemical coast that experienced its most catastrophic modern flood event in 2017, when every Superfund site the AP surveyed was underwater, and the EPA could not reach any of them for days. A buried legacy of nearly 2,000 unregistered industrial sites sitting in a county that, according to FEMA records, has experienced a major flood event at least once every 5 years over the past half-century. And now, the scientific consensus that Gulf Coast subsidence alone will account for up to a third of future inundation exposure, meaning the next Harvey, and there will be a next Harvey, will reach places the last one didn't, on ground that is lower than it was in 2017. The San Jacinto waste pits, after Hurricane Harvey, were covered by 14 feet of water. Post-flood dioxin samples came in at more than 2,000 times the EPA's threshold for action. It took 5 years to begin excavation. The cap that was supposed to contain the waste had failed at least 6 times before the storm touched it. And that site is the one we know about. It has a name. It has a case number. It has a paper trail. The 2,000 sites the Rice-NYU Brown team identified have none of those things. They have addresses. They have neighbors. They have children playing in yards above ground that was used, decades ago, to store or process things that do not belong in soil near human beings. When the next major storm stalls over Harris County, and the historical average says one will, the floodwater that enters those yards will not be sampled. It will not be reported. There will be no aerial imagery review. There will be no case number. There will be no press conference. There will be muddy water receding from a neighborhood, and no one will ask what was in it. The city of Houston is already being measured from below. The satellite radar studies that produced the subsidence maps used by Leonard O'Henhen's research team detected vertical land motion changes of less than a millimeter. Instruments so sensitive they can register the ground settling under the weight of a building, under the pressure of drought, under the slow collapse of an aquifer compacted over decades of extraction. The earth beneath Houston is being watched with extraordinary precision. The 2,000 sites left behind by a century of industrial activity in one of the most chemically intensive urban regions on the planet are not being watched at all. What stays buried does not stay safe.